Hey beloved, today's podcast is going to be about redefining grace. I'm Yvette Ratshikhopha, author, life coach, and wellness educator. The reason I wanted to have this conversation about redefining grace, you're probably wondering why we need to redefine grace. So I'm going to start by talking about my definition of what grace is, my redefinition, because this thought came to me as I was driving and listening to some other teachings. So grace is when you look at yourself, or when you see yourself for who you are and not what you've done. I'm going to say that again. Grace is when you see yourself for who you truly are and not what you've done. So this came to me while I was listening to some other spiritual teachings. And yes, my podcast, I know that, I talk about healing from a coaching perspective, from an NLP perspective, meaning neuro-linguistics programming, which is what I do as a holistic healing practitioner. And we also talk about spiritual things, right? Like the universe, God, the divine, all of that. So this came to me and I thought it was very important that I share this with you, because we think grace is when we think that we are not worthy of something. So we almost have to beg for that grace, right? And I really want to shift the way that people see themselves. And that's always the intention of my podcast, my YouTube videos, everything that I put out on my platforms. And sometimes the certain things that we believe, whether from like a religious point of view, whether from like a social structure point of view, or social influence or cultural influence, we always have to look at those things and see if they serve us or if they don't serve us. So grace, again, is when you look at ourselves or see ourselves for who we are and not what we've done. So a lot of times, everybody has a context, and the last podcast that I had spoke about that, like forgiveness and context, right? So in order to have grace for yourself, you need to look at your own context and realize that certain behaviors, certain ways of being your past as a result of the way that your life kind of started up. And so many times we get these teachings, right? From different spaces, religion, or just teachings in our society, which say that we're unworthy. And for example, though I ain't good enough, he's still, and I'm like, whoa, who told you you're not good enough? Right? And that's the conversation I'm trying to have through this too, by redefining grace. Because grace, right, if we're looking at ourselves for who we are and not what we've done, then we understand that that's how God looks at us, or the divine, or source, because source knows our context. I want you to note that source knows your context. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit. So meaning that God, or the divine, or source, looks at us through the lens of who we are instead of what we've done, right? Or where we've been, or the things we've done. We're not defined by those things. So source knows, for example, right? So your context, again, so maybe you've had a rough life, and for somebody who's been assaulted at a young age, maybe violated sexually, and then they grow up and then they become promiscuous, because what happens is when you're violated sexually in your childhood, for example, you then think that in order to get love, right? That's the kind of, you have to, have some sort of sexual relationship with someone. So somebody who's violated in their childhood in that manner, it really messes with their ideas of what love looks like and how to get love or attention. Because a child, when that happens to a child, for example, they notice that, when I do this, then I get affection, attention, love. And that's why sometimes even kids don't report these things, because first of all, they don't know that it's wrong. And you might find that out later on in your adult years. So when you look at yourself and you're judging yourself, right? Because I don't think that Source judges us, because Source knows our context, like I said. So Source knows that you were violated at a young age, you were abused at a young age, that you didn't grow up with your dad at a young age. So you actually don't know how to respond to male energy. You don't know how to respond to attention from male, or you're willing to do anything to get that attention because of the rejection that you suffered in your childhood. Or you were bullied, right? And you've done some certain things in your that you are blaming yourself for, or you're being hard on yourself for. So when you say again, grace is, looking at your context, or looking at yourself for who you are, not what you've done, then you're not judging yourself for those experiences, because you understand your context. And then the reason I'm saying Source knows your context, because God knows your context. And if God knows your context, God is not judging you for the things that you've been through. Because I see it as a child, if this Source energy, this God that we believe in, this higher being sees us in our journey, is just like, oh my God, I wish you knew how worthy you are. I wish you knew how good enough you are. And therefore, I'm going to do this so that you can see and hear the message. I'm going to send many teachers to come onto this earth, to come and tell you that you're good enough. So I honestly, me as Yvette, right, don't think that Source, who knows us in our journeys and our struggles and our challenges, judges us for the way that we've carried ourselves in our journey. That way may not serve us, but it has a context, and therefore I don't think Source judges us. Instead, Source says, return to love, return to who you are. I see you as who you are. I want you to see as who you are. I'm going to send many teachers in your path, right? The teachings, there are many teachers like Jesus, like Buddha, so many of them, to come and tell you and remind you how good enough you are, so that you can see yourself through that lens, right? So when you see yourself as who you are and not as what you've done, you understand that you were always worthy, that you were always good enough. And that's the lens that God, Source energy, wants you to return to, and see yourself through that lens, and see other people through that lens, and see the world through that lens, right? So this is a teaching that I think is so important. And when it came to me, it was I've worked through a lot of my experiences and things that I needed to heal from my past, right? And I've given myself grace. I know who I am, and I see myself as who I am. I know I'm light, I am love. You are light, you are love. You are made in the image of the most divine. Your goodness, you are good enough. You've always been good enough. Even in moments where you felt like you're so far away from being good enough, you were always good enough. Because who you are, truly are, doesn't change because of the things you've done, or the things you've been through, or the way people treated you. So Source is not judging you. I hope this is resonating to anybody who's listening to this. And yes, this doesn't mean that you must move away from certain beliefs. And this is also why there's just certain things that I don't say, certain prayers that I don't say, certain things that I don't. I'm like, I'm not worthy, but I am. Why on earth would the most loving divine Source do so much to help me come and return to self? That doesn't sound like something you do for someone who's not worthy. Everything that the divine has done to get me to where I am says I'm worthy, says I've always been worthy. Yes, I might have drifted from the understanding that I was always worthy because of teachings, because of the way people treated me. So grace, giving yourself grace, is seeing yourself as who you truly are, as divine, sacred, lovable, and enough. And I want you to also just be conscious moving forward when you're about to say that prayer that beats you down rather than lifts you up and honors who you truly are. Because I don't believe that when we speak ill of ourselves, we're honoring the divine. I honestly don't believe that. I don't think we need to beat ourselves down in order to honor that which we are created from. I think instead we need to see ourselves for who we truly are and live in that good enoughness and live in that worthiness. Because remember, once you see yourself for who you truly are, you realize that you're complete, you're whole. There's this thing that is in my book And I'm about to end this podcast because I really didn't want it to be long. But there's this where I say, whatever you can't say about God, you can't say about yourself. And that's your context, that you're divine, you're sacred, and you're good enough. And you're made in the image of the most divine being, which we call God or source. What? Regardless of how you name it or call it, that's who you are. So when you think of grace and forgiveness, right? Think of that when we drift from grace, we drift from who we are. It's not really about you being this being that is broken and battered and so far away, removed from goodness. I guess, if we want to label things, because that's another thing about labeling things, right? So you are not. So grace is that. And understanding grace means understanding that you've always been worthy, and understanding that source understands your context and sees you through the eyes of love. And grace is source seeing you through the eyes of who you are and through the eyes of love, and saying, my child, I really want you to return to who you are and see who you are, and understand that these things that have happened to you were not your fault. They don't define you. They're not who you are. They might have determined your behavior, and I have grace for that because I understand your context. I see your context. I see why. Because your dad left. I see why, because you were rejected so many times. I see why, because you were treated differently because of the way you looked, spoke. I see why, because you didn't feel safe. This is why you responded in this way. I see why. That you've experienced so much suffering that you saw joy in everything else that may not have necessarily been good for you, even though it was for a moment. I see why. And that's grace. So grace is, I'm going to define it one more time, and then I'm going to end this podcast. Grace is looking at the life. Looking at yourself to who you truly are and not what you've done or where you've been. And looking at others through the lens of who they truly are and not what they've done or what they're doing sometimes. And looking at the world through the lens of, through that same lens. So I hope this podcast spoke to you, this audio spoke to you. And I'm sending you love where you are. And I really hope you give grace to yourself. Because that's the most important person you need to give grace to, yourself. And understand that source is not judging you, because source understands your context and sees you and hears you and knows your heart. And from journey with yourself from that perspective, and not from a perspective of beating yourself down. Because God understands where you've been and why. And the most important thing is that you start to live your life through a point of self-love, acceptance, and grace for yourself. And that's when you start to truly live as who you are and return to who you are, because you understand that your worth never depreciated or disappeared, or you were never even broken. But something told you that you were, and that's the thing that you need to heal. Okay, I'm sending you off with love. And yes, I hope from this message you take what resonates with your soul and release what doesn't. Because truth, our souls always know what truth is. Subscribe to my channel or follow me wherever you're listening to this. Love you guys. Bye. Okay, one more thing. There literally isn't anybody who's changed their lives by judging themselves, by being hard on themselves, by beating themselves down. Not a single soul. So instead of just, there's nobody that, can change their life if they still believe that they're broken, or they're bad, right? So only through looking at ourselves through the lens of who we truly are is how we can change and transform our lives for the better. From that point of grace. And that's why I say work on yourself from a space of knowing that you're enough. It's about returning to that version, or returning to that truth rather, right? And then being that and living in that light of who you truly are. So you can work on yourself from a point of grace and the point of knowing who you are and returning, because that version already exists. You just need to align yourself with it. So that's another thing that I want to say, because moving forward as you're practically doing the work, already your soul knows who you are. These things that have told you that you don't know who you are, but your soul knows. And you're literally just returning to who you are. So just remember, your soul knows. Your unconscious mind knows who you are. There's a part of you that really knows the truth about who you are. And nobody has changed their lives by beating themselves down. But they have changed their lives by understanding themselves, giving themselves grace, and improving from a space of love. Because when you love yourself, you want more and better for yourself. And you're able to do the things that you need to do to get or to return to who you are. So again, love you guys. And sending you all the love as you journey with yourself with grace.